right. So good evening. We are in our second session looking at the development of the country and its society, its culture in the time after the Civil War. That period of time in which should have been kind of a societal high, a good feeling. We made it through the crisis. But instead, it really didn't go as well as we would have wished. And as we saw last time, that lack of the high period will ultimately lead to a very explosive spiritual development. That would be our third great awakening, which we might should talk about that. We will sort of talk about that. Usually it's folded in to what we will look at probably in 3 or 4 weeks. So again, kind of framing the conversation, and this is the way I will always start my American History 2, or what we call 2020, but the second American History class that we typically teach, you may remember from being in college, there's an early one that goes to the Civil War, and then there's one that goes from Civil War to modern times, is that when you come out of the war, the one challenge is that for the first time in studying the national history, we're over the entire continent. So there's a whole focus on what's going on in the West, and maybe that actually should be a session that we'll do maybe in the future, a 2 or 3 week session just on the development of the West, the cowboys and the Indians and the gold rush, and some of those aspects could be a lot of fun to incorporate. But in general, you have this period where you have the country transforming, and it doesn't feel right. You've all had an experience, as I have, where you put on a shirt or you put on some pants, you put on some shoes, and it just doesn't feel right. And you're trying to figure out that I gained weight. Is it the wrong outfit? What's going on? And if you went ahead and wore that clothing, you felt uncomfortable the whole time. And you couldn't put your finger exactly what was wrong, but you knew something wasn't right. And you couldn't really tell, but you probably never wore that outfit again. When you got home, you said, I'm not wearing this again, or you tried to figure out what was happening. And that's a way to understand what's happening to the country at this moment. Because you fight the Civil War and you have this great crisis moment. And again, it's not like when you have these great crisis moments, it's not like there's a committee that meets and says, oh, well, this is what we learned. And then there's a flip the switch and we go on. It's always, like all of history, it's kind of moving, right? It's kind of moving along a journey. And it's really only, later that people look back and go, oh, I see what happened here. But obviously we have the benefit of being 300, 400, 500 years back from something, the Civil War, 170 something years back. And we can see kind of what transformed and what changed there. They don't have it any more than our great crisis we're in now, probably will come to some conclusion by the year 2030. It might be by the year 2025. But when it does, it's not like we'll all just go, oh, wow, it's so much better now. Much like, remember we studied the Constitution. When we did that a year and a half ago, they wrote the Declaration, they fought the Revolutionary War. The war is finally over, but there's still all this question about how they governed and so there's kind of this ongoing sense of transformation. Well, in this moment now that we're looking at, so 1880s roughly to say 1920s, things just don't feel right. And they don't feel right in various regions of the country. And we're going to look at some of those regions or in kind of industries. So I mentioned the West. We could spend time on the West. We're going to, but when we look later at kind of a solution that comes. And that's the way I usually teach it with my students, is that you go from this feeling of like what's not fitting right to what is a possible solution. So in this series that we're looking at, we're going to spend 3 or 4 weeks trying to identify what didn't fit, what was feeling uncomfortable. And then we're going to move to the West probably at the end of October, or maybe right before the end of October, and look at the first solution that'll move us forward into this, end of this period and really into the early 20th century. So last week what we looked at is we looked at the development of industry. And I showed you this picture last week. This is Rockefeller looking over one of his factories. And one of the things that we noted, but we just noted in passing, but you probably could grasp it right off the bat, is that all of the industry, or most of the industry, congealed and consolidated in certain locations. And those locations became the dominant urban societies. So as the country's making this transition from a rural to urban place, as it's making the transition from an agrarian lifestyle into an industrial lifestyle, what you begin to see happening is people, rightly, understandably, moving to where the jobs are. So in the period between 1860 and 1910, 1870 and 1920, there's this explosion of people moving into the already large population centers. So I just want to stop there for a minute and give you like a personal story, right? So I grew up in East Tennessee, rural East Tennessee, in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, right between Chattanooga and Knoxville, near the Tennessee River. I grew up in a little tiny town that had, one blinky light and 2 stop signs. The nearby big city was the county seat that had about 13,000 people in it. And they thought they were something. They would tell, we're the city, that you're just country bumpkins. Later, when I left, I realized the whole county was a bunch of country bumpkins. We were none of us were city people, right? But when I was a young boy in the early 70s, for Christmas one year, I got my own FM stereo radio. It had a turntable and everything. You probably remember those. Mine actually had a turntable and an 8-track player. And for the first time at the age of, say, 12 to 14, I could listen to FM radio from the 2 largest cities, which, as I just said to you, we were in the middle between Chattanooga on our south and Knoxville to our north. And so as a young child growing up in the country, I began to listen to the radio, usually the rock and roll radio, of Knoxville and Chattanooga. And you would hear about all these events that were going on in these big cities. Now, of course, as you remember, back then, people did not travel 40, 50 miles just for the fun of it. We would go to Chattanooga or Knoxville typically 2 or 3 times a year, and usually connected to buying clothes for school and Christmas. And that was it. We never drove 60 miles to go somewhere. Like you and I sometimes, if you live in Sanford, you'll drive 50 miles or so to get down to Disney and not think anything about it. But back then, as you remember probably, we never did that. So as a young boy growing up, I had this allure, this fascination of the big cities, and believed that my future might lie in some of these big cities, maybe in music. Maybe I could be a rock and roller, or in some capacity of a business, maybe a lawyer working in the big city. Right? This magic of the big city is born at this moment. Now, certainly when you go back in our national history, there were other cities that were larger than nearby, but never was there really any big cities in the United States in the 17 and 1800s. But with the coming of industry, something begins to transform where you can see all of a sudden over time, between say 1880 and say 1940, the society will move and shift from being a mostly rural society to being a mostly urban society. On that lower right graph, you can see, obviously, as we know today, it becomes a mostly urban society. Now, again, I chose to live here. I'm assuming you chose to live here. And even though we live in Winter Park, we're part of Metro Orlando. So we can claim I live in Winter Park and there's 30,000. And when I did the campaign back, at the beginning of the year, you'd have people talking about, oh, there's so much traffic, as if Winter Park, and what are you going to do about it? As if Winter Park, 30,000 people lived all to itself. And I would always remind people, you're part of Metro Orlando, where there's 2.5 million people living here. There's more people living in Metro Orlando than there were in the entire East Coast when we wrote the Constitution. So, there's questions that we might begin to ask ourselves about the challenges to our country's governance and its structure, but all that begins to transform at this point now. And the magnet was industry. So as industry grew, people could make a little more money and have a little more, they believe, secure society in industry compared to working in the fields. However, What this did was it transformed and raised the problem of the urban society. So that's really our look tonight, is what's going on in the urban society when our country is in this time period. The urban society becomes a challenge. And I would suggest it actually is still a challenge to this day. And you may know, if you look over the past, well, at least 30 years of elections, many times, all of those times, the elections, even when President Clinton in '96, when he won pretty handily, all those times, it actually was a close vote from a numerical point of view, right? The popular vote is always, 48, 52, 47, 53, something like that, right? Reagan's '84 election was the last real blowout that we had. And so, but when you look at a map over the last 30 years, I should have brought that map. You've seen these maps where they show you the voting for one party or the other. Typically, one party in nowadays times, and it's usually the Democrat Party, wins all the big cities, and the Republican Party wins all the landmass. So you, even in our own day, can see a tension between urban societies like where you and I live versus rural societies that are not in that mix. So this issue of urbanization really takes place here. As you can see, in 1870, there really were only a few cities larger than 50,000. And very few were west of the Mississippi and south of, in the old Confederacy. But they will begin to take off and grow. So that you can see by 1920, there are several cities that have over 100,000. And as we're about to see, there are several, there are 4 or 5 cities that are into the hundreds of thousands and into the millions. Chicago, New York, I think Philadelphia, San Francisco and LA are not quite there yet, I think in 1920, but they're closing in on 1 million people living in a very tight geographic space. So this raised all kinds of issues and exacerbated this sense of something's not right. Now, it's interesting to me, whenever I drive, I think I told you this last time, you go on a trip anytime, and I did just, about 2 months ago, and you drive through parts of coming from us, from Florida at least, going north through Georgia or South Carolina or Alabama, and this past time I was up in Ohio, and there's just so much empty land. But we all choose to live in these close locations for all the amenities and opportunities that we think living in the urban society brings us. So it's not like it's all bad. It's just that there's this kind of interplay of when you have that many people living together, how does a society handle it? So I want you to watch a video here. There's no sound. This is a video from that's actually film footage from New York City in 1911. And hopefully it'll run for us. It did earlier today, so hopefully it's going to do it. There is sound, but it's made up sound, so I'm gonna get rid of the sound. So this is just coming in off one of the ferries. We're just gonna look at a couple of minutes. I'm gonna be quiet and just let you watch for a second. This is actual footage that was filmed in 1911. So this is just some of the footage that we can see of what society looked like at that time. They dress a lot nicer than we do. See some of the shops. Man, there's probably a Civil War veteran. From time to time, you'll watch people like this young boy there, and they'll just stare at the camera. They don't really know what to make of it. Of course, we do the same thing these days. We've seen videos being made of modern times, and somebody's in the background kind of looking. See the shopkeepers, people coming out for their day. There's early subway. You see the cars are on the road now, so a lot less horses on the road. There's a very rich family being driven. Notice the driver's wheel's on the wrong side for what you and I are used to. Could have been a car from Europe. So a lot of horses. Again, so it looks somewhat like we might experience a society today. It's not like it's a horrible looking thing. New York does have elevated trains, though we're more used to Chicago being the elevated trains. Still a lot of dirt. They dress very nicely for dirt, don't they? I think if we went back in time, we wouldn't feel too out of place. I'm sure we would all moan about not having air conditioning. Here at the end, there's a clip of going over the Brooklyn Bridge. So Brooklyn Bridge was completed in the late 1890s, and of course was a fabulous innovation of transforming society. I'll back up so you can see a little more of that. Hang on a second. You remember last time we were talking about the innovation from some of the leaders of the industrial movement, Westinghouse and Tesla and Ford, Bell. So society is transforming. So the cities have this kind of magnetic pull to them, but they had challenges, right? So there's these issues that begin to emerge even in the midst. And I wish we were together because I would ask you to help me, but because we live in an urban society, I bet you could tell me, or you would say without even looking, the challenges that they had in 1890, 1880 are really no different than the ones you and I have today, right? So there's issues from too many people, right? Which raise questions of safety relative to fire, safety to crime, to trash collection. The water was not clean. Less than 10% of the cities in America had any filtered water at all. So they were just drinking, gross water, which of course then explains a lot of the disease issues. There was nobody responsible for picking up the trash. There was nobody responsible for cleaning away dead animals. So sometimes you'd have just horses that would just drop dead, or dogs or cats, and they'd just be left in the street. People just like walk away from that. And overcrowdedness. The overcrowdedness is, I think, the thing that's most shocking to us, is something that we would not have really understood. And here's some pictures from the city. And this is all these are from New York, which is, our principal city still to this day, obviously. If you ever traveled to third world countries, or to not even just third world countries, if you go to Paris and you go near Notre Dame, you'll see this idea of the outdoor street vendors. But if you go to Mexico, if you go to Africa, if you go down to Greece, you go to Turkey, you'll see these. You'll see this. So in Italy, when I visited Florence, you turn one corner and you just end up in this maze of just these kinds of shops. You don't see this anymore in most American cities unless you go to, like a fair, or if you go to a kind of a garage sale type thing. You don't really see these very much. And so the crowdedness was like this really big situation. In 1890, New York City had a population density that was roughly 1,000 people per acre. Now, if you're like me, you may go, wait, an acre? How big is an acre? It's basically the size of a football field, a little smaller than a football field. So imagine 1,000 people standing on a football field that you can think of. So close to you and me here in Winter Park is the high school football field right over here off of Katy Way. If you went there and you put 1,000 people on that field, now we could all stand there. It wouldn't be too much for us to stand there and have a party or something like that. But imagine you lived there. I mean, you wouldn't have more than a couple of square feet beside you. Today in New York City, there's over 8.5 million people there, close to 9 million people. And their density today is about 40 to 50 people per acre. Now, obviously, it varies from location to location. So New York in 1890 had a very rich population. It was kind of a magnet for the millionaires that we saw being developed last time. They didn't live in 1,000 people per acre. They owned vast, land masses that aren't even there today because the city's taken all those places largely away. But the point of all this is you can imagine what it would feel like to have that many people kind of crammed in on each other. And then you can imagine, we're worried right now, right, about the coronavirus. And one of the things that they've said that most everybody feels that they agree to is that it's worse when there's significant numbers in an enclosed space for a prolonged period of time. So if you go to a store and there's 50 people, but you're there for 20 minutes, 15 minutes, it's probably not that big a deal. Now, you guys are there in Stover right now. I can see some of you, and there's 8 or 10 of you. You're spaced way out. You're there for an hour, but it's still, there's not that many of you. You could even double or even triple the size there, and you'd be probably okay. But imagine there are 500 people in that room, or 500 people in a classroom, or 500 people on a football field having a party. Well, not surprisingly, the coronavirus spreads a lot easier there. It's just really impossible in that kind of space to keep yourself distant from each other. And that was all of our big cities. I mean, poor sanitary conditions, just disaster from a sense of health point of view, of trying to keep people clean, trying to keep people safe, trash everywhere. And as more people came into work, you had more people arriving, making the situation harder. Added to that, as I'm about to show you in a second, America between 1880 and 1920 is experiencing its highest level of immigration ever. It goes down after 1920. We've not come really back to the same levels of people we were letting in. Not that we shouldn't let people in. I'm all for immigration, but just when you look at the numbers, I mean, just boatloads and boatloads of people coming in. And of course, where are they coming into? Our main ports, so Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and then where would they typically go if they left was to another city. So you have these challenges. So then what we needed was solutions. And of course, all these solutions are obvious. If we know that there's a problem for fire, you and I would say, well, they should create like a person or a group to take care of that. Initially, they had volunteer fires. And many of the fire departments were more like gangs. They would go around and they would sort of sell themselves as insurance to certain businesses. But there was always a lot of competition between these groups. And there are reports of in the 1870s and 1910 period, before the idea of a city fire department, where a fire would be set, sometimes accidentally, sometimes just go off, sometimes on purpose, or like arson. And rival gangs representing these fire departments would show up and they would try to block. So building A is on fire and they've got protection from the fire department, D. And the fire department group C would show up and get in the way and try to stop them so the building would burn down. I mean, it's just, you think about that and your head just explodes. You're like, what are they talking about? But that's the way they did it. Now, if you look at all these things, and again, I wish we were together. If I ask you what's the common issue with, or part of fact with each of these issues, hopefully what you would say to yourself is, well, all of those have to be run by the city. And now think back to what we said 2 weeks ago in the beginning of last time, when I told you what happens in the last great crisis of the Civil War, what comes out of it, or what happens in every great crisis, is a transformation of how people understand their expectations of government and what they're willing to accept. And what we saw happening under Lincoln in the Civil War, and then later in Reconstruction under Johnson and Grant, was this expectation of that the government needs to do more. Well, now that's at the national level, but now we can see in these various cities at the local level, by the time you get to 1910 or so, there really begins to be this momentum for somebody should do something. And the somebody can't just be local gangs of fire departments or certain streets having clean water, but not the other streets. Certain places having protection by a night watchman, but not other places. And what then becomes of this is that you are going to see the growth of city government in order to provide the protections that we want. If buildings are unsafe, for instance, a solution, as you can see, is, well, we need codes. There needs to be rules about what kind of building can be built, and there then need to be rules about how many people could live there. In most of these cities, you go back to this picture here, it's a drawing, but in most of these pictures where you would have a basically tenement house, probably about half the size, or for some of you, maybe the exact same size of the place you live there in Westminster. Imagine there being 10 to 15 people living there with you. In some of these settings, there would be 2 or 3 families. My grandparents, my grandfather, when he finished fighting World War I, came home, so now we're talking the 1920s, but it still kind of fits. He and his brother and their wives moved to Cleveland, Ohio, from Tennessee for work on the railroad. And the two families and their 6 children lived in an apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, that was about 800 square feet, which is, roughly the size of most teenagers' bedrooms in most houses in Winter Park. So the 4 adults and the 6 children, they were all under the age of 5, I believe, all lived together, which is family and that's fun. But just think about how crowded and how rough it would have been on my grandmother and her sister-in-law to try to, keep the house together. And then that kind of explains, well, where would the kids be? Well, they wouldn't be in the house. So where are they? They're off running around outside, which again, yay, fun running around outside. But when you think about these pictures and you look at the idea of your children out running around, you can begin to see, well, I don't know if that's really the best idea. And so what begins to happen is you start seeing development occur in a way that would provide solutions that could help us. And they all go back to the idea of a stronger, more interactive, supportive maybe government. But now again, before I go to the next slide, what does that mean? Who's going to pay for all these things means what? Means more taxes, which of course, naturally, duh. But then if you remember your longer American history story, you realize, wait a minute, we had a revolution in 1776 because of taxes and representation and voting, but really we just didn't want any taxes. And then remember when we were looking at our road to the Civil War, what happened in the 1830s, South Carolina almost had a civil war then because of tax. So we're not real fans of taxes, but yeah, we have these situations we need solutions to. So they begin doing things, they start building up, going higher. Actually, Chicago will have the first and more skyscrapers than New York, at least initially, because of the fire, which we'll look at in just a second. We'll talk about it in just a second. They begin to make the process of moving away from having horse-drawn public transport to machine run. Remember last time I told you that the Industrial Revolution kind of centers around the idea of the combustion engine. So between the railroad's growth, what we looked at, and the rise of the combustion engine moving beyond steam, New York begins developing, as you know, it's very famous for today, their system of trains, most of which are underground. Now here's another video I want to show you, if I can make it work. This is 1905. We're just going to go right here to the end, watch the last little bit. This is one of the trains running in 1905. Let's get up here to where the light is. And it's just the actual footage of the subway kind of running through one of the first films produced and one of the first films showing how the trains worked in these tunnels, which of course now New York is quite famous for, obviously. And it's rolling into the station here, and you're going to see the station people. Again, they dress a lot nicer than we do these days. They're out for their Sunday best. It is not a Sunday in this film. This is a normal day. And they're all racing to get on and all dressed well. Not just the men. You'll see a family come through or some women. Maybe it's going to be, I don't think I've worn real shoes and socks in over a year now because of the coronavirus. But they look nice, don't they? They're dressed up well. Everybody's getting on the train, doing their business. Of course, think what this does to help with not only the speed of transportation, but the issue of overcrowdedness. Now you're going to be in a place where you can bring in more solutions for the humans, such as expanding where people live. By allowing the trains, you could go further and further up Manhattan or further and further away from the industrial centers, whether it's in Pittsburgh or even in Atlanta, though they're not going to have subways or anything like that in the South. But as they develop that, so you can answer the question of overcrowdedness by building up, or you could build out with the railroad. And of course, eventually we know that's the electric trains, the cable cars in San Francisco, the elevated train, the L in Chicago, the subway in New York. They're going to do other things to try to solve some of these problems relative to the human condition, right? So you're going to see the emergence of claiming for a park. So Winter Park is very proud of its parks in our name. We have the highest degree of acreage per citizens of any city in the whole state. And we have our own Central Park, which is named obviously in honor of Central Park in New York, which was developed in 1873. You're going to see the beginnings of, we're going to come back to this in another session in this series. You see the beginnings of the public school system. And one of the things we saw last time was that children worked. Well, of course, you and I know children, everybody worked. All children worked. It wasn't just a problem of industry. But when you can bring the industry, the danger, and the dirt, and the health all into this mix. Remember my three uncles, and it was two uncles and an aunt, and then their three cousins, all living in Cleveland, Ohio. They're running around, who are these little urchins? Whose kids are these? What are we doing with those kids? So they begin the process of developing free public school. Again, not really free, it's paid for by taxes. Libraries begin to blossom as a way of perhaps offering knowledge to all levels of society. You're going to see, and we'll talk about this more next week when my peer Heather Bryson, Dr. Bryson, is going to help us look at some of the development of kind of the rise of women as the leading agents of social change in this time period. And Jane Addams is one of my most favorite people. My daughter, you may remember me telling you, my middle daughter is a social worker up in Michigan. And she's fallen in love with the work, and she works helping children in foster homes. That's kind of her angle, at least for now. And Jane Addams really starts this whole idea of the social worker. In Winter Park, we have our community center, and we have like the public parks and recreation department that put on programs, and anybody can go, but of course it's located in Winter Park's poorer or lower income side of town on purpose. So the children who live near there could walk over to the center and could do sports or do arts and crafts activities, maybe get extra tutoring. All that goes back to Jane Addams. And you have this growth of this sense of we need functional change like clean water, police forces, building codes. We're going to build higher. Of course, that's going to demand electricity because nobody's going to want to climb up 6, 7 flights of stairs. So, of course, the elevator is going to emerge at this point and provide the opportunity to go up. The train's going to let us go out. And so you have both functional changes that are infrastructural changes, and then you have human changes, which are trying to answer some of the problems of crowdedness. Now, we're saying trying to answer because, again, as I said earlier, one could make the argument that in the year 2020, there's still great problems in all of our large cities. And there's lots of reasons, which is not our focus of the meeting. But just to point out that this is a century old, and if you go to Europe, it's 2 centuries old because the industrial movement, as you remember from last time, was there first. But they're going to make efforts. So let's kind of take a look, see how they did some of those efforts. So here's one that I like. In 1893, a group of volunteers in New York began coordinating together to say, we need to try to clean up this problem. Now, again, eventually we're going to get to the place by the 1905, 1910 period where the answer is the government needs to do this. These volunteers began saying, we can do this. And as you can see, some of the leadership was from the Christian or the religious side of leadership in New York. And that also plays into that, what we would call the Third Great Awakening, which begins this process of the social justice movement. There's a famous book that was written by a Christian leader this time called In His Steps. And it was talking about, it kind of describes Jesus being in the urban society in like 1905, 1910. And what would he do with the filth that you can see in this picture, with the children who didn't have anybody helping them, with the poor people crammed into a set of housings and not being able to have clean water? How would he solve this problem? And so you have a group like the East Side Relief Work Committee, and they begin in the area where they lived to make significant changes, volunteer hours, as well as creating recommendations to give to government to say these are things that need to happen. And most of the recommendations that you can see there in that bottom part of the slide was enacted. Things like unfit housing being condemned, bringing in more fire safety, both with firefighters, but rules for building, how they're going to build things, trying to prevent owners of buildings from putting in too many people, my daughter who's at school in North Carolina is looking at an apartment to room in with a house with 4 other girls. And she just sent me the lease agreement, right? And in the lease agreement, the owner is writing rules that bind him, like I cannot put in too many people in this house beyond this number. And then he also has written in there that you as the renter cannot add in other people. You can't sub-rent out. And that's, again, a kind of back to a rule about how do you prevent overcrowding and regulation in the process. Let's look at 3 cities that give us just a snapshot, a picture of this. We're kind of talking about New York because they're kind of the poster child for all of our growth in the city. But Chicago, our second city, or often the city of big shoulders, the Windy City. If you remember when we talked about Lincoln and Douglas and their debates and the railroad growth that was part of what becomes ultimately Bleeding Kansas, we talked about how Douglas, as the senator of Illinois, had acknowledged that if he could get the railroad into Illinois from San Francisco, from California, that would allow him to be in a situation where he thought he could divert a whole lot of trade to a small little town on Lake Michigan. He was talking about Chicago. And so he was right, obviously, because you can see between 1860 and 1900, it goes from 30,000 to 1.7 million. So it really does become the second city. Now, I think it's no longer the second city. It's probably supplanted by LA and maybe even Dallas, Fort Worth. But Chicago is still one of, obviously, our preeminent cities. It has a great fire in 1871, which you're probably familiar with. You can see it was vastly destructive in the process. What it did was it opened up Chicago to become one of the leading places of development in providing those solutions that we were just talking about. What are some things we could do? And obviously in their case, because of fire, they looked at fire as a mechanism by which to say, how do we prevent this from happening again? Building codes, what kind of strategies, how do we build up, and how do we build up safely with steel, with metal? How do we protect the citizens? How do we deal with some of the growth? Their industries, of course, were the railroad, but the meat industry. If we do look at the West, one of the things that we'll see is the West has a few very distinct industries, and the meat industry from mostly Texas becomes the dominant connector to Chicago. Of course, we always have eaten meat in the United States, but we eat a lot of meat, as you may know, and you may appreciate a good steak or a good pork chop. That all comes at this moment in time because with electricity and the development of the industry, they're able to figure out how to have a refrigerated car and then get the meat to Chicago. If you look at one of those pictures over there, this one over here on the right over here, all that is cattle. And so again, Chicago becomes famous for its meat industry. It also became famous for its culture. New Orleans will make the claim for being the birthplace of jazz music, but Chicago makes a competing claim for being a place where jazz exploded. So they both can, to some degree, be the birthplace. At this time period between 1880 and 1920, African Americans are leaving the South, finally, in what becomes known as the Great Migration. And the vast majority of them will go up the Mississippi River, either by boat or by train, to end up in Chicago, which is largely directly north, as you know the map, over New Orleans. And so Chicago is going to have this influx of people, influx of culture, and by the time you get to the early 1900s, has really redeveloped herself. Here's a picture of Chicago after the fire. So places that were built, that were developed to be kind of the new city. And again, if you and I went back in time in Doc Brown's DeLorean, like from Back to the Future, we landed here, we would not really find ourselves thrown off. We would recognize, if not the specific buildings, we would recognize the style of these large buildings on city streets, and we would not be surprised by that. Let's go out west. So if Chicago is the city of big shoulders and was reborn after the Great Fire, San Francisco is the Paris of the West, and it is also going to be rebuilt after its own crisis. Much later, 1906, but the 1906 earthquake equally destroyed a large swath of San Francisco. And when it did that, it again opened the door for there to be a renewal about building. How do we build? How do we make things safer? How do we fix things? You can see that their population will explode also. Notice how after the earthquake, Congress gets involved. So you can sort of see by the early 1900s, this idea of more involvement of the government in trying to help the cities. They won't have the elevated train like in Chicago or the subway in New York. They'll have the cable cars to deal with their really hilly terrain. If you've never been to San Francisco, it's got some pretty steep hills near the waterway, so it's not as easy you couldn't build a subway in that process. If Chicago had to deal with an influx of a racial minority in African Americans, all of California and the West Coast, but San Francisco perhaps most famously, becomes the center location for Asians coming from China mostly, but some from Japan, from Korea, other places. In China, California was known as the land of the Golden Mountain. And so it was a big draw to go there. Unfortunately, the anti-immigration movement that we'll see in just a moment was also pretty effective, so that in 1882, there's actually a law passed by Congress excluding an entire race of people in the Chinese Exclusion Act. This will eventually become an anti-Asian immigration act and will play a role in what happens between us and Japan through the early part of the 20th century. Now let's go south. If those two cities were destroyed by natural disasters, Atlanta, as we saw in our last conversation or back in the Lucas of War, was destroyed by the war. So again, a city destroyed, rebuilt in this time period. It doesn't grow as much because you remember when I showed you the maps of the cities in the country, really there's only 3 or 4 cities in the South that ever grow above like 100,000, but they are growing. You can see by 1910 in the metro region around Atlanta, they're up to 500,000 people. So that's pretty significant growth. We'll look a little more at this next week when we talk about, or week after next, I'm sorry, when we talk about the civil rights movement, because it's going to take us back to Reconstruction. But when we do that, you will notice an idea called the New South. And what the New South was, and Atlanta becomes kind of the gateway city or the example of this, was that it was suggesting that they had accomplished the economic diversification that Reconstruction had hoped to accomplish. Now, I would suggest that most historians would say they did not accomplish that, but that's the argument that they make, that they are accomplishing it, that they are about to go through that. And you can see what the leader of the Atlanta Constitution, and that should be a Y, G-R-A-D-Y. I don't know why that's G-R-A-D-E. It's Henry Grady is his name. He was the editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Constitution. And he really becomes the principal agent of going to the North and trying to suggest to people like Rockefeller that they should invest in the cities of the South and in industry. And he was one of the ones who led to, in 1885, the development of the Georgia School of Technology, which you and I, of course, know as Georgia Tech, and in Atlanta. So again, to focus on technology, engineering, innovation, kind of growth on the hard sciences side of things. As you know, behind me here is my Coca-Cola machine. That's an original Coca-Cola machine from my grandfather, my other grandfather, my mom's dad, that he got in 1920 sometime, working on the railroad and down in the South on the old Southern Railroad. Well, so you're not surprised to see me talk that Coca-Cola became one of the leading companies in Atlanta. They built the technology, the chemistry was first done in 1886, but the company was built and planted in Atlanta in 1892. Much like the other cities, they also have challenges with their racial minority. In the South, obviously, it's the freedmen. It's all the freed slaves who are still around. Between 1870 and 1900, there was a pretty healthy, and they would have thought, African Americans would have thought that things were going well for them in Atlanta. But by early 1900, things begin to go sour. Again, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. And you can see that they are largely excluded from participation. So we're not really seeing the growth of what we would want to see as far as civil rights goes and development. Part of that is because of how politics were done in the cities. So this is the era of the bosses, the machines, which, by the way, still exist in some cities. But the idea was corruption, which we said 2 weeks ago, was rampant throughout the country in politics. and nowhere more so than the cities. And so you had basically someone who had consolidated power, usually through underlings, almost like a chain of power positions. And they typically in the cities would work through the saloons. And so you'd have people running their neighborhood, their 4 or 5 blocks, from like this gentleman here in the picture, kind of sitting on this saloon in New York City. And in one sense, what they were doing was what the urban cities had not done yet for government. They were providing services for poor people. They would give people food. They would help people find jobs. They would help immigrants find their locations. Maybe that's why you end up with immigrants, particularly in New York, but also you see it in Boston and Philadelphia, living in certain geographic locations with each other, right? And so we might think of this as kind of segregation, and it probably was, but there also was a sense of, oh, you're Polish, you should go move to these streets because everybody there is from Poland and you'll understand them. They had newspapers, or you're from Italy, or you're from Ireland, you're from these various places. And the machine kind of ran that. But of course, they ran it like the mafia runs protection, right? In that I'm gonna do this for you, right? But what are you gonna do for me? You're gonna vote when I tell you to vote. You're gonna come out when I tell you to come out. You're gonna support me when I tell you to support me. And of course, then that is not what you and I would call like fair politics, right? That's not really democracy. It's not really the idea of we're voting for who we want to vote for. It's sort of run like a machine, right? Behind the scenes, somebody's planning who's going to go where. The most famous of these was Tammany Hall, again, New York City. Boss Tweed was kind of the leader. But again, throughout all the major cities, you have this. And there is a connection to organized crime. We'll talk more about organized crime in a later session. But in this time period of the late 1890s to the early 1920s, you have this growth of kind of who is actually running society, right? And so in some of the big cities, you do have this kind of connection between organized crime and the city bosses kind of making their control of things. And you get this kind of gangster culture that's going to really emerge by the time of World War I. Now, I mentioned immigration, and we really need more time here, but I just want to point out to you that, again, this is really where you see the United States becoming this land of opportunity. And as much as I know we have our challenges these days, I think one of the things that's most frustrating to me is when people who live here now and mostly have been born here and lived here all their lives act as if this is the worst possible place you could live, when all the data is to the opposite. There may be moments when it is unfair for your age, your sexual orientation, or your race. I get that. And there are things that happen that you and I both feel sad about. But in general, that data point there from 1870 to 1890, 63% of all people who immigrated somewhere in the world came to the US is still true today. That you typically every year can total up everybody who on the earth moved to a new country, and all the other countries combined have less people moving to it than the United States by itself. So clearly, it's not a bad place for us to live. And so they came from everywhere. And you can see this coming both what were called the old immigrants. So again, from the original settlers. So Northern Europe, France, Scotland, Ireland, England, some Scandinavia, and then the newer immigrants. Now, some of this has got to do with what's happening in Europe. And I was thinking today, where are we going to go in November? And I got 2 or 3 ideas, but one of them is I do want to spend some time at some point with us looking at what happens in Europe in the 19th century. We talked about the United States and the Civil War. Now you and I are doing later Europe, later 19th century. Maybe let's do Europe too at some point. So because of things that are happening in Europe, you begin to see this kind of new immigration movement coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. So here again, here's original up to 1860, and you can see how big the German contingent is, see how big the British contingent is, Ireland. Now look here after 1910. England basically disappears, Germany drops to 4%, and now look what grows instead. Russia, Baltic, Austria, Hungary, Italy. So a lot more people coming from the eastern and southern part of Europe. Here's another graph showing you the percentages of people living in the cities. So remember, we're talking about the population, some of the challenges in the cities. Well, obviously, when you add in all these immigrants coming to the cities, it's a lot, right? I mean, there's just a lot going on that are kind of adding into the pressure point, right? That's making the changes. Now, unfortunately, this leads to opposition. So this period of 1910, 1920, and again, we'll talk about this in a later session, we talk about civil rights, is really the growth of kind of the anti-immigration viewpoint. And we'll just leave it there for now, but some of it is maybe we would say it's coming for a fair reason, right? We're crowded enough already. Who are all these people? But it usually got displayed in an ugly and unwelcoming kind of way. But note, it didn't stop people from coming. People still wanted to come here because this is the land of opportunity. And part of what they wanted to come was for this. You've heard me complain before that there is kind of we've become almost drunk on our excess. We've become kind of seduced by luxury, and we're addicted to ease in these days in the year 2020. But that all begins back here. So in this time period, you certainly have that elite wealth that we talked about last time with the industrialists, but you also begin to have a middle class. As you can see there in the cities, you have upwards, depending on which city you look at, 30% of the families having a live-in servant. I don't know anybody, and we live in Winter Park, which is really rich, who has a live-in servant these days. They may, I'm just saying I don't know anybody. And you know, I've gotten to meet a lot of people living here the 25 years I've lived here. But back then that was something that you did. And that was a reflection of the wealth that the middle class was having. Now wealth, obviously it's relative, but they have discretionary income that they can have somebody come live with them. Now it really was more like an indentured servant type of situation. These people weren't being paid well. And they usually wanted to get out of this role. But nonetheless, you still have this kind of industry, you might say. And now what this does is it provides the very earliest example in the country of people having discretionary time. Up to this point, except for the planter class in the South, you really found nobody in the country that had discretionary time. In the North, you found rich people pre-Civil War, and they had discretionary income, meaning income you don't need to pay your bills, but they rarely were living at a luxury time, right? There was a small group, maybe. In the South, there was more in that planter class. Now, as you move into the early 20th century, it begins to spread to where more and more people have, and that comes from this idea of what we would call the Gilded Age. Now, there's more, we'll talk about that term Gilded Age later, so just leave that alone for now. But as we look at the cities, we're seeing the societies to begin to develop ease and luxury. You see the growth in the cities of department stores. So Wanamaker's in Philadelphia is the first one. Of course, Macy's in New York is very famous. And there's all the stores you may know of from some of the big cities. This is the moment where you connect consumerism with marketing and the power of the railroad. Remember, it's always the railroads, which is that last time. And you have the development of what basically becomes Amazon today. And that's Montgomery Ward and Sears and Roebuck, which were places you could go, but not everybody lived in the city, obviously. So you would order something, it would come on the train. And some of you know, my students don't ever believe me when I tell them this, back in the day, you could order literally anything from Sears, including a house. And you would build the house. If you had the land, Sears would ship you everything for the house and go have fun, build your house. And some of these houses still exist today. You begin seeing the growth of the chain stores, like our version of, say, CVS or Target, where it's the same store everywhere, and it's not owned by anybody at that location. It's a chain that begins to develop. Now, we're not really to the franchises of McDonald's, which will come in post-World War II, but it is in that ballpark. And again, what's it feeding? It's feeding shopping, shopping, shopping. And of course, then what is that feeding? Advertising, advertising, advertising. And what do we know is happening today, or what happens? Advertising pays vehicles of communication. So today, the internet, YouTube videos, obviously network TV, ESPN, they pay money. They get paid money by advertisers to show their customers these ads. You and I know how this works. And it really begins in this time period. I mean, there's ads for things pre, 1880, but not like this. And the magazines and the radio become the dominant mechanism by which you see advertising share their news. In fact, go back to this slide picture here. That little picture there is from Sears and Roebuck, and that's an ad suggesting to women, hey, here are some clothes you could wear in the spring or the summer. You should consider buying this. And so that idea of marketers telling you what you don't have is something that you need. And that, of course, is part of the whole story of advertising and marketing. We're not really talking about that right now. And the cities begin to develop around mass entertainment. So you begin to have vaudeville, and eventually you have things called Nickelodeons, which had the earliest kind of films that you could see. I mentioned jazz earlier. Ragtime actually precedes jazz, but you begin to have the idea of traveling bands who would go around. Of course, this happens, well, pre-COVID. This happens all the time, right? Rock and roll and bands and orchestras and operas, and they're all traveling around the country and providing entertainment for us in the city, right? They're not going to Christmas, right? They're not going to Deltona. They're coming to the big city to present this thing, and they do this kind of stuff. And you have the very early emergence of what is a 20th century development of mass professional sports. So all the rest of the sports we know today as a profession will really emerge in the 20th century. But baseball was our first one, emerging in the late 19th century. And again, the idea of all of this is that the cities provided something, as I told you when I told you about myself. In my little town, we had one movie theater with one screen. And then later when I was a teenager, we had 2 screens. That was it. And then once a year, there'd be a rickety old fair that came to this one little shopping center, which we had a parking lot smaller than the Target over here on University. So there weren't a lot of things on there. And some of you may remember going to fairs like that. But I listened to the radio. I would hear the great big city, and then have concerts, and then have events, and then have speakers, and then have plays, and then have all these things that were coming. They had sports. They had the big football sports for the university, but they had professional baseball in Lookout and Chattanooga Lookouts, and you had all these things that to a boy growing up in the country was like, wow, that's fascinating. And that's what leisure time begins to develop in these cities as people would go, and you start having this idea of going out for leisure, and even you'd price it so that even the poorest people could go. They could ride on the subway, they could get to the ballpark, pay 5 cents for a stadium seat, they could pay 10 cents and get a hot dog and a drink of some kind, and that would be a meal for most of them. They could go to Coney Island, they could see like electric lights, they could ride some rides, there'd be a Ferris wheel, there'd be the beginnings of what you and I know as the roller coaster industry, and they could have this experience of life all in the big city. The big city is what really begins to develop society around the industries. And as they struggle to put these clothes on, it's not fitting right? They're going to begin to start looking for solutions as they try to figure out how best to live in the city. And as I said already, we probably still haven't figured it out yet because the cities keep growing. People keep coming to the large cities. Orlando is a classic case of, pre-Disney. We're very small. Some of you might have lived here back then, late 50s, early 1960s. And there were, maybe 30, 40,000 people living in Orlando. And now we're metro 2.5 to 2.6 million people living here. And they keep coming. Everybody keeps coming to Disney, down to Florida, right? And they're not just coming to rent. They're not going to DeLand or not going to Christmas. Not usually. They're coming into Orlando. That's part of the city's draw and its attraction. And there's challenges and there's opportunities. And that's kind of the urban society. Here's where we're going to go in the next few weeks. Next week, I really hope you're here. My friend, she's been there with us at Stover, Dr. Heather Bryson, amazing professor, is going to come, and we're going to talk about her, what happened in the same time period, 1880s and 1920s, within the women's rights movement. So suffrage work, reform work, a lot of different areas where women are beginning to really let their voice be heard. Then the next week, we're going to look at civil rights. And the next week, we're going to look at political reform. And then we're going to see some of the solutions congeal. So I'm looking forward to showing it to you for the next, we're going to be in this probably, like I said, through October, and then we'll do something different in November. Again, man, I wish I was there. We could ask questions. I want to, again, remind you, if you have any questions, if you're watching this video later than Thursday and you want to ask me a question, please just email me or get it to Becca. She'll get it to me. If you're watching, you know, you can always use the chat feature, but email me. I'd love to answer your questions for you. Hope you guys have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next Thursday with my friend, Dr. Bryson. You'll love her if you haven't seen her before. All right, thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.